All right, I should probably get into the actual show for today. The actual stuff I have written down to talk about. First of all, this was one of the most interesting stories I saw, and it's related to Iran. This is from Breakthrough News, who do great work. Everybody follow Breakthrough News. I believe it's Rania Khalek and some others. They said, you probably saw this viral Instagram post claiming that the Iranian government sentenced 15,000 protesters to death. The post got almost 900,000 likes before being taken down for false info, but the incident proved how disinformation can be used to manufacture consent for war. So, a blatant example of disinformation, a completely false, made up claim that the Iranian government sentenced 15,000 protesters to death. In a post that got 900,000 likes before it was taken down, and this is in the U.S. on social media, on a mainstream social media company owned by Silicon Valley oligarchs, Instagram, and they're putting out fake news about Iran that 900,000 people are liking, and way more than that, over 1 million are seeing for sure. And this is the country where they just try to create a disinformation board as part of the Department of Homeland Security to censor people. And this is a country where they're constantly talking about cracking down on disinformation and misinformation, which is really just anti-imperialism. Anybody who's an anti-imperialist is a Russian puppet spreading misinformation, according to the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. State Department. Yet here we have blatant misinformation from U.S. mainstream media outlets, as we're going to see later. And there's no crackdown on it. There's no cry from Western media. What are we going to do about this? The misinformation. Zero. Zero for actual, real, blatant misinformation. So getting into the details a little bit here, this graphic was based on false reporting based on a Newsweek article. The Newsweek article cited a CNN article as proof that Iran's parliament voted to execute 15,000 protesters. The only problem, the CNN article said nothing about 15,000 executions, which is something that happens a lot of the time, right? I mean, this is interesting because you have Newsweek, a corporate media outlet, citing CNN, another corporate media outlet. But what you'll have often is like NGOs, like Human Rights Watch, which has been criticized many times for having literal CIA members on their board and for being very close to the U.S. State Department. These NGOs connected to the State Department are connected to the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, which is basically a private version of the CIA. They will report something, right? They will make some report like, oh, we spoke to 18 Chinese people on the phone, and they said that there's a genocide going on in Xinjiang. So they'll put that report out, and then all the mainstream media outlets, all the corporate media outlets will take that Human Rights Watch report and cite it and turn it into a headline. China doing genocide, China doing genocide, China doing genocide, regardless of whether it's true or not. So you have corporate outlets using outlets directly connected to the U.S. State Department, and then blasting that information in a high volume all across the country. Here, Newsweek is just citing a CNN article that's fake. It's not even an NGO. There wasn't even an investigation. They're just like, CNN said it. It's true. 900,000 people now believe this completely fake story. They say the parliament signed a letter calling for protesters to be punished, to teach them a lesson. It did not say to execute them. CNN states a few protesters are facing charges that carry the death penalty based on the severity of the alleged crimes, but most have not gone to trial. Iranian courts have handed down one protest-related death penalty on November 14th to a protester who was convicted of setting a government building on fire. So, I mean, if you want to get mad about authoritarianism with the Iranian government, here you go. They sentenced one person to death for lighting a government building on fire. You could be mad about that. But the story about them sentencing 15,000 people to death, that is a story crafted by the U.S. State Department or people connected to them, or U.S. finance capitalists, I should say, to get you to want to do regime change in Iran. It is a fake, what we call atrocity propaganda story, similar to the Naira testimony, which kicked off the Gulf War and was also completely fake, to get you to want to overthrow Iran, because the U.S. has wanted to overthrow Iran forever. I remember when the war in Iraq was going on. I was very, very young, and my parents would watch the news a lot, or when it had just first started around 2004. And they were talking about Iran every single day. We got to get Iran too. Iraq's not enough. We got to get Iran too. The U.S. government has wanted to destroy Iran for so long. And this atrocity propaganda BS, making up stories to try and get people to hate Iran, weaponizing people's compassion, saying if you're a good person, you'll help us overthrow Iran. Otherwise, you're a piece of shit who supports the government killing protesters. I mean, this is the oldest trick in the book. This is what they do every single time. Yet leftists will fall for it again. I'm sure Vaush has already fallen for this. Among those who shared the story. So now you see the partnership between corporate media and the U.S. State Department directly. The people who are, directly behind or who are driving this effort to do regime change in Iran, folks like Mike Pompeo, Justin Trudeau, the top Iranian regime change advocate in the U.S., Masih Alinejad, I don't know how to pronounce that exactly, Mitt Romney. These people are sharing this fake atrocity propaganda from the corporate media. So the media, it's so funny that the media is supposed to be a watchdog of the government and of the corporations who control the government. They're supposed to be watching out for corruption and be really hard on the government and be really critical of them all the time. And this is what our media is doing. Our media is making up fake stories that get shared by State Department officials about Iran to get people to want to overthrow their government. Because the Iranian government, most of their banks, most of their industry, their healthcare system, it's all publicly owned, right? It's owned by the people, or, you could say technically owned by the government, redistributes a lot of the wealth to the people, rather than being owned and pillaged by Western multinational corporations. That is why the U.S. wants to take out Iran. Iran is an Islamic republic. They're not a socialist republic. But much of their industry, much of their productive forces, you could say, are in public hands. And U.S. transnationals cannot have that. Although the post was eventually taken down, good. The virality of the post shows how quickly things could have escalated. People used the false headline as justification for humanitarian military action against Iran. This is how the war starts. Hey, the Naira testimony. I was just talking about that. Good job, Breakthrough News. The Iraq War famously started based on the lie that Saddam Hussein was building weapons of mass destruction. But the first Gulf War was also justified based on a false testimony that claimed Iraqi soldiers were going into hospitals and removing babies from their incubators. And this was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S., I believe, who did this lie. The U.S. massively increased its intervention in Vietnam based on an alleged attack of U.S. ships by North Vietnamese patrol boats off the Gulf of Tonkin. This is an interesting thing to look into if people haven't, by the way. It's just crazy how blatantly they lied to invade Vietnam. There's no evidence for this either, and the U.S. probably blew up their own ship. In 2003, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara admitted the Gulf of Tonkin attack actually never happened. In the lead up to the U.S. intervention in Libya, NATO intervention in Libya, we're going to talk about this in a sec, actually. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, claimed that the Libyan government was giving soldiers Viagra to sexually assault civilians. Even though it wasn't true, the story was used to justify the UN vote to authorize intervention. If the U.S. was honest and said they wanted to invade a country to plunder its resources, people wouldn't support war. Fake atrocities allow them to garner support for wars from people who would otherwise be anti-war. Boom, right there. Read it a million times. Print it out. Put it up in your room. The weaponization of compassion. Fake atrocities help the U.S. State Department garner support for wars from people who would otherwise be anti-war. Social Democrats, liberals, people who call themselves leftists but maybe don't consider themselves socialists or anti-imperialists. People who just sort of follow the news cycle without getting really in-depth and doing a lot of theoretical study. Those are the people who are tricked by this stuff. People who consider themselves good people. We want to help the people of Iran. Of course, we wouldn't want to destroy them, but we're helping them, right? We're helping them by telling blatant lies about their country so that we can overthrow their government and have Western multinationals pillage their resources. Isn't that what Iran wants? Isn't that what they need? It's crazy. This fake story smells of one thing: war propaganda. Dang right. Great job there from Breakthrough News. Great job. As I say every time with Iran or Russia, no, they're not socialist countries, right? They're still, our solidarity still needs to go to the socialist communists in these countries struggling for socialism, as with everywhere in the globe, including, places like China, where they've already had a revolution and put the working class in power. They're still struggling against imperialism to build socialism and deserve our support. But even in countries like Iran and Russia, we should still support socialist communists in there, realize they still have a job to do, blah, blah, blah. But we need to defend countries who aren't socialist from imperialism, right? There are so many people. I was rewatching our criticism of Marxist Paul the other day related to Russia. And basically the thrust of his argument is like, Russia isn't socialist. Why should we care about them? Like, that doesn't mean they should be destroyed by the US. That doesn't mean we support regime change in Russia or war with Russia, right? Self-determination and the sovereignty of the people comes first. That's number one. You need sovereignty and self-determination if you're even going to build socialism. We don't support imperialist actions against countries because they're capitalist. And, there's always a reason for these imperialist actions, right? The US isn't doing it just because they decided one day they don't like Russia and Iran. They're doing it because Russia is trading a lot with Venezuela and Cuba, and they helped out Syria when the US was trying to do regime change. They're helping countries that actually do call themselves socialist. And then Iran, the US wants to take them out, like I said, because a lot of their industry is public. Similar with Russia, under Putin, after the neoliberal shock therapy, with the fall of the USSR, when all their industry was sold off for pennies, Putin came in and nationalized a bunch of it and reinvested a lot of it in the Russian people. That was a move towards a more socialistic economy, even though Russia's still not socialist. All right, so there are still reasons why the US wants to destroy these countries. And when you ignore those reasons and just simplify it as, oh, well, they're capitalist, I don't really care. Or, Iran's not socialist, they're an Islamic revolution, I don't really care. Like, you still should care. You should still care about their self-determination.